Hello, it's John Heaton. I thought I'd say a few words about, what to believe and what not to believe about stuff which has been written about the Beatles. And I was watching a video on Pop Goes the 60s channel, Matt Williamson's channel, superb channel, and he was interviewing, Erin Weber, who's the author of the Beatles historical some book or other, and whether to choose primary sources or what to believe, basically, and should one believe a primary source or a secondary source, etc., etc. And she was, and Matt as well, basically dishing Lennon Remembers, saying it was a product of its time and was basically flawed. From my personal point of view, if a Beatle says something, I'm going to listen to them. And if Philip Norman or Ray Connolly or even Mark Lewison says something, I'm going to treat it with a pinch of salt. And I don't care, maybe Lennon remembers 1970, the famous interview. Yes, it was a product of anger and he was feeling pissed off with the Beatles, but it's such a fascinating listen, and I can forgive John, I'm one of these fans who can see that and put it in perspective and see how he contradicted what he said in Lennon Remembers in the Playboy interviews in 1980, for example, said that he lied about not collaborating with McCartney. So maybe the casual fan can't see that, but I have always been able to distinguish what I think is truth from exaggeration. And in the same way, the David Wigg interviews, the Beatles tapes, a lot of those interviews were recorded around the time of the Beatles split. And I'd far rather hear Paul, George, Ringo and John talk about the Beatles split or impending split at the time as they were recorded in the David Wigg interviews. And, Erin Weber says it's best to have a distance of 50 years after an artist is dead to be objective, but I don't agree, because who's to say that 50 years after an artist is dead you're going to be more accurate than you were when you actually listened to the interviews at the time? And I've always thought that the Beatles interviews in the 70s, particularly in between 69 and 1980, before John died, are the most influential and important interviews that they did. And I think, if you listen to Paul or Ringo now, I think their memory is understandably not what it was, and one can't rely on it quite so much. So I think the David Wigg interviews, at the time of the Abbey Road album being released, talking about what their favourite tracks were, and even saying that, the Beatles weren't necessarily dead. I think that's fascinating, and it's far more fascinating than listening to, or than to read some author 50 years after all the Beatles are dead saying what they think, because they're that much divorced from what happened. And as for Albert Goldman, even Matt Williamson was defending some of what Albert Goldman said. Okay, well, I can admit that some of his material was accurate, but he has such an agenda, and such a book needs to be completely dismissed in all circles. And I'm not sure what Erin Weber said about Albert Goldman, but that kind of book is just despicable and isn't even worth the time of day, really. No, the thing about the Peter Jackson documentary, the Get Back thing, is you're a fly on the wall, and he hasn't actually done any commentary. He's just presented 8 hours, nearly 8 hours of footage, and said, make up your minds. And so that's what's best. And there's an 18-hour director's cut, which will be even better. And I'm sure that will also be very influential in determining what we think of that era. And not that I want to slag off Michael Lindsay Hogg's film, because I think, the 80-minute film has its place historically, and I would love to see it remastered and reissued, because it has a place in history. But as Peter Jackson said, in the film you can see how they react to a crisis. George leaves. What do? They don't panic. They just come together. Basically, and George comes back. He brings his 8-track studio, and they end up in a much happier situation at Apple. And that's so wonderful to see. And that's talk about primary sources. That is proof in the pudding that the Beatles, were not splitting up at the time. They were into the project, particularly John and Paul, less so George. Ringo was just along for the ride and was happy to be there. But who else is there among groups where we can see that amount of footage? I know someone was saying the Rolling Stones came there first because they did the that footage of Sympathy for the Devil, were recording that, and that was recorded before Let It Be, but that was fairly short. This is like 60 hours of footage, and Peter Jackson's released 8 of it, and 18 hours is on the director's cut, and no doubt the other 42 hours is, or 38 hours, sorry, is available if people want to see it. And I'm thoroughly with Peter Jackson that people want to see this. And people talk about, and Erin Weber was saying, primary sources are important and they can't be ignored. Well, yes, they can't be ignored, but they shouldn't be treated as gospel, is what she said. But I would much rather hear the Beatles story told by John, Paul, George or Ringo, even if it was John angry 1970 or Paul angry 1973 or whatever it is, than Philip Norman, Ray Connolly or even Mark Lewison. So I just think the Get Back movie is proof that primary sources are the bee's knees, basically. And I've always thought that. And the David Wigg interviews, I've always thought, are the best interviews surrounding the Beatles split, because they were recorded at the time. And with hindsight, in the anthology, Paul and Ringo have got, and George as well, have got different memories. And they're, in some respects, they can't remember what went on, so their memory is jaded. But so I'm much, there's an interview with Paul, I think around the time of Abbey Road, where he's saying the Beatles are my 3 best mates, and that's what I go on. And I'd much rather listen to interviews at the time than retrospective stuff. And Lennon Remembers, I think, is an important document, but agreeably he was bitter at the time. But I still think it's a fantastic interview, and it shows, it exposes so much material which the other three Beatles would never even dared have talk about. And so for that respect, I think it's brilliant. So that's my opinion. I mean, I think, we can get into methodological issues about certain interviews, like not having validity. But at the end of the day, the primary sources are what counts. And even if they were jaundiced at the time, that's what makes for... That's what I listen to the most in terms of interviews from the Beatles. Interviews from the four themselves, whatever state they were in, whether it was close to the breakup or after the breakup. And I'm one of these people who can distinguish between what Lennon said in Lennon Remembers and realise that some of it was over the top, yes, but it's balanced by what he said in Playboy in 1980. And I'm intelligent enough to make that distinction. I think all Beatles, or most Beatles fans, should be able to do the same. As far as Paul trying to be revisionist in recent years, well, I think that's true to an extent. For example, trying to turn the Lennon-McCartney songwriting credit into McCartney-Lennon, I think, was a bit of a joke. And also, I think you should just let it be, pun not intended. And I think what John, Paul, George and Ringo said at the time, late 60s, early 70s, is far more revealing than anything they say today. And, I get it. Peter Jackson's documentary is showing them in a far greater, more positive light, and I'm fully supportive of that. And but I don't think one should forget what the Beatles' views were at the time that they split, even if it was driven by acrimony or whatever. I think you need to take everything in context, and for me, the contemporary interviews, whether it be in the mid-60s, the late 60s, or the early 70s, are far more revealing than any interviews that the Beatles ever did in the 90s, including the anthology. Because I think, time, I don't know, tends to colour one's opinions, and that's all I'm going to say. Thank you.